How do you want to handle the flow of this one?
What do you mean?
Welcome back. A quick turnaround on the D3 Datacast. It's a big week. So that means it's a big week of content for us as we eagerly anticipate the arrival of the 2025 Division III men's basketball tournament. If you missed yesterday's show, we dove in deep into all of the first round matchups and hope you enjoyed that. If you got a chance to watch it, if you haven't, go back and check that out. It was a lot of fun taking a look using the efficiency ratings, the D3 Datacast computer ratings to really look inside each matchup. And along the way, we use those computer ratings to look at win probabilities for each team and the computer lines. And so we're going to take another modified view of those win probabilities and take a zoom out look, right? Look beyond the first round. What are each team's odds to advance through each round of the tournament? We're going to be talking about who those favorites are to advance to the second weekend, to advance to a Final Four, and to lift the trophy there and end the season as the national champion.
Love to do this kind of thing. This is the tournament time. Everyone's so excited for these games, Zach. I'm kind of getting sick of talking to you though, because we did a Sunday live stream for like 5 hours. Then yesterday we did a show that I think went over an hour where we talked about the first round pods and the matchups. But here we are again for another show. We're going to talk about the full bracket odds. But this is the fun time of the year, right? So this is why we're coming back and back and back and talk about these games and talk about these teams.
Absolutely. We're going quadrant by quadrant. So let's jump right back in, starting with the Wesleyan quadrant, as we'll call it, as we same place we started in our first round preview show. Okay, so no surprise, Matt. Wesleyan's a heavy favorite to advance out of the first round, joined in the pod. We talked about this one in terms of an 8-9 matchup. Actually, Gettysburg maybe is slotted there as a 9 seed, but it's probably a little bit of a favorite in terms of how the computer sees this matchup. But if you're looking at the favorite, the heavy favorite to advance to the Sweet 16, no surprise, it's top seeded Wesleyan. We go down to the other pod. They're the top half of the bracket. This would be hosted by WPI, who is a 75% favorite there. Stockton, a little more moderate favorite over Ithaca. That was one of the more interesting first round matchups, maybe surprisingly interesting matchups that we talked about in episode 109 in our first round breakdown. But Matt, really, I think when you're talking about hosts in the opening weekend, it's no surprise to see them being the favorite to advance. And that's certainly the case for WPI in terms of individual odds. But it should be noted that that's a number under 50%. So if we're talking about WPI or the field, that one would actually go to the field.
Yeah. Great to point out. I should make one small note about methodology. When we're talking about this full bracket odds, we very quickly lose the ability to or I have chosen
Adjust.
to lose the ability to adjust for home court advantage very quickly. So some of these rounds start assuming neutral court games a little sooner than we would. So if you look at a true host like WPI, maybe they are actually more like 50% or just above to advance the first weekend. So there's probably a couple percentage point areas of slop where home court advantage. So everyone's going to have to maybe forgive me a little bit on that. But yeah, you're right. We've highlighted in gold the most likely team to advance to a specific round. But it is no surprise that when you're looking at any sort of quadrant, that a team like Wesleyan, the top seeded team, and then like the fourth seed overall, WPI, would be expected from the top half of this bracket to advance on through the first weekend and into that Sweet 16.
And that's a good caveat, Matt, because we'll go right into some more of the slop here, where we see the Ramapo Claremont Mud Scripps matchup. And since this has not been adjusted for home court, like we looked at in our first round preview, that's kind of flipped the favorite here in what was a pretty evenly matched first round game here. But with Ramapo actually hosting that one, if you go back into episode 109, where we talked about this first round matchup that did account for the home court, that was slightly in Ramapo's favor. Drew, a 68.6% compared to 31.4% for Mary Washington. But Drew, again, no surprise, as the highest seed here, is the favorite again, but similar to WPI, less than a 50% number here for Drew as the favorite to emerge out of this pod.
Yeah, interesting here for Drew, and also was the case for WPI. Like right? You're less than 50-50 to get to the Sweet 16. So it's like you're still the favorite in the first weekend in your pod, but there's a lot of different places that could go. And you see everyone in this kind of Ramapo, CMS, Drew, Mary Washington pod. Every team is kind of between like 15-ish and 45%. So you wouldn't really be surprisingly, even we talked about in yesterday's show that Mary Washington is maybe a better team by the computer than you might just look based on the seeding. And they still have non-negligible odds here to advance the weekend. So if you're looking for like who's one of the most likely underseeds, kind of like pod 4 seeds to get through, it could be Mary Washington in this pod right here. But it's not like it's a bad pod overall. The rest of the teams are very good, very even. And that game against Drew, I mean, they're going to be underdogs the whole way, right? So that first game against Drew is going to be tough, but they still have some chances of maybe getting through there.
The last pod in this bracket, we go with our other top 8 protected seed with Emory, who, no surprise, as one of those top seeds in the entire tournament, better than
Yeah.
75% chance that they are leaving the first weekend, emerging in and heading into the second weekend as the champions of this pod. Guilford, a favorite over Barry. And if you're looking at, maybe an upset bid, Guilford's been, very upset minded of late, making their run through the ODAC tournament. But, compare that 75% number to the 15% number. Emory, a heavy favorite to move on to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, and I wouldn't think of it this way, but like Guilford and Mary Washington look like they have similar odds to reach the Sweet 16. Part of that is the difference in the other, like, right, like Mary Washington, if they get past Drew, they're going to have to play Ramapo or CMS, whereas Guilford would likely play Emory. The computer sees there as a different in opponent quality, so Emory being a much more difficult team to play there. But interesting to me, so if we advance a little bit further on this to the right, we start getting percent chance to win Sweet 16 to the Elite Eight. Even a school like Emory, like Wesleyan, the top 2 seeds of this quadrant, still over 50% to win that round of the Sweet 16 to reach the sectional final. So right here, our computer is seeing pretty heavy favorites for Wesleyan and Emory to reach that sectional final over 50% of the time. Our computers saw that as being the case, which is kind of interesting when you talk about all the possibilities of matchups. Some matchups are still more difficult, approaching 50-50, but these two seem to have paths that favor them getting there a good chunk of the time.
Yeah, and I think you can really say that that continues through the odds to win in the Elite Eight round, right? Where you don't see anyone else with a double digit number there, whereas you still see Wesleyan with a 58.8% chance and Emory with 22.8% in their favor. So that is really putting Wesleyan and Emory on a collision course for a sectional final, playing for the right to go on to the Final Four. Again, maybe not totally surprising considering they clearly are the top 2 seeds, and that, of course, that's determined by NPI and not our efficiency ratings here. But again, the computer is in agreement with NPI in that regard, that these are certainly the top 2 teams in this quadrant, and worthy overall as top 8 teams in the bracket.
And then even going on from there, our computer sees Wesleyan as over 50%, nearly 60% favorites to reach the Final Four. So heavy favorites overall in this quadrant. Even 30% chance to reach the championship game, and then a 1 in 5 shot all the way of winning the whole national championship. So Wesleyan being the number 1 overall seed in the tournament, you would expect a couple things work in their favor, right? They're a high quality team, so they're one of the top 1, 2, 3 teams in the country, whatever you want to call them. And being the number 1 type seed would give them as favorable as any path in the country. So those two things really work in their favor. They're great, and they've earned the right to have a great path. And I think that leads to the computer seeing basically 1 in 5 chance of Wesleyan being crowned national champions.
So that's the outlook in terms of overall tournament odds out of the Wesleyan quadrant. Let's move then to the NYU quadrant, where obviously it's no surprise to see NYU as a heavy favorite to go on to the second round. Although I think that could be an interesting second round matchup, whether it's John Carroll or York. But still, the computer likes them approaching 80% odds there to move on to the Sweet 16. Another one of those favorites to move on, but with odds that are under 50% is St. Thomas. Although, as you mentioned, they are hosting, so you could probably goose that a little bit. Um, but it doesn't drop off a huge amount. If you compare the Cal Lu and Hardin Simmons, it's kind of spread between the two with 29.2% to get to the Sweet 16 for Cal Lu, 18.9% for Hardin Simmons. So you feel like if you add those two numbers together, whoever comes out of that stands a pretty decent chance. We're
Yeah.
kind of getting to the range where we're talking about really that's probably when you count for the home court going to be like a 50-50 type matchup. Should St. Thomas, of course, avoid the upset in the first round for who's going to come out of that Texas pod and match up with whoever comes out of that NYU pod.
Yeah, and we really talked about even pods in the last slide as well. But I really like this pod down at St. Thomas in Texas. You get some amount of just interest in Cal Lu, Hardin Simmons, and St. Thomas about any one of those teams being able to come out of that pod. A couple of good matchups, really interesting first round matchup with Cal Lutheran and Hardin Simmons, and then whoever wins that, likely to get St. Thomas in the next round, and that will be another good matchup as well. I think we talked on yesterday's episode, Zach, about how the John Carroll York Pennsylvania matchup looks pretty even. Here it's a 50-50-ish type game, anyone could win. But then the computers then obviously have NYU as probable heavy favorites on the next night with basically a 95% chance to get past their first round. So even though that's an even game, they're going to have a difficulty, and they know they would have a difficulty, right, when you get paired into an NYU pod, that would probably be difficult to come out of.
TCNJ, a favorite over Pitt Bradford, and host Hampton Sydney, a heavy favorite over Bryn Athen. Hampton Sydney better than 60% odds according to the computer there to go on to the Sweet 16. Of course, as they were the national runner up a year ago. And it's kind of a similar outlook there with Tufts, Matt. Tufts approaching 70% chance to get on to the Sweet 16. St. Joseph's, Maine, a little bit of a favorite there. They were at our pick slate that we talked about in our yesterday's episode. That looks like it's going to be a really intriguing matchup. Two teams that like to play fast, but really Tufts looking at like a very solid favorite in this pod to move on to the Sweet 16, and then you look ahead another round. They look like a 50, kind of 50-50 odds, even before the outset of the tournament here to advance on to play in a sectional final. NYU, the other favorite to be there at almost 50%, or excuse me, almost 2 out of 3 type odds there for NYU to win in the Sweet 16 round.
Yeah, it's interesting to me when you look at who the computers predict to get through to rounds, and sometimes it's not that interesting, right? Because who do they pick? Well, they pick the top team, NYU, and they pick the number 2 team, Tufts, and you pick the number 3 team, Hampton Sydney, and the number 4 team, St. Thomas, and that's the predicted Sweet 16. Like, isn't that novel? To me, a lot of the interest is in what are the percentages, how do they change, how do they differ between all of those teams. You see Hampton City and Tufts both like 60 to 70% chance to advance their pods into the Sweet 16 rounds. But St. Thomas just under 50% there. So even though they are the favorite, it's not really a majority of the time that they're getting past. There's more of a plurality of the time. And NYU is obviously heavy favorites. But one thing we get to talk about today that we didn't get to talk about yesterday is really some of these potential Sweet 16 type matchups that we could see. I think a Hampton Sydney Tufts matchup is an interesting matchup that maybe we don't see all the time in the country. You get that kind of Boston area versus that Virginia team matchup. It's a great tournament type matchup. Would be excited to see how that one plays out. Here the computer shows that overall Tufts has a 51% to advance the Sweet 16. About a 25-ish percent chance for Hampton Sydney, so a little bit less than that. But that would be an exciting and great game to see.
And no surprise that NYU would be the favorite to emerge out of this quadrant. It is their quadrant after all, as one of the top 4 overall seeds, and that's something that the computer is in agreement on, ranking NYU as the number 3 overall team. So no surprise to see them be the computer's favorite, considering the computer sees them as the best team in this quadrant. You're talking about The computer sees them having nearly 50% odds to make it to the Final Four. Kind of 1 in 3 type chance to go on to the championship game, and a 16% number there in terms of their odds to win the championship.
Yeah, and I'm always fascinated to see like how large are the odds of those top teams getting through, getting to the Final Four. And they always seem really high to me. Like, how can you get that all the way out there, like 50% of the time or so? But that's kind of just what overall bracket odds seem to say.
All right, Matt. Maybe look down at the number there for Tufts to win it all. 5%, right? So we're not talking insignificant here. We're talking about a 64 team tournament, and 5% is 1 in 20. So they've got their share of the odds pie here going in. So that's maybe another number to keep an eye on. That can compare that to what we saw in the Wesleyan quadrant. That's a little bit better than Emory was as the 2 seed there. They had a 3.9% number.
Yeah, in a 64 team tournament, if everyone had even odds, it's basically what, like 1.5% that any given team would win the tournament. And then obviously, those percentages are going to be pushed more heavily towards the top type teams because, again, they're going to win like their first game more like 90% of the time, not 50% of the time. Have the easier path. They're better teams. That's why they've earned that right. So maybe not overall surprising that they're the best teams, but yeah, there's some odds there for other teams as well to advance.
Taking a look at the next quadrant where Platteville is the number 1 team there, the number 5 ranked team by the D3 Datacast computer. Heavy favorites over Grinnell. I think as we took our look yesterday, maybe the heaviest favorite in the first round. And also the computer sees them as pretty heavy favorites to go on to the second weekend, 71.6% there. Uh, Denison, a favorite over Franklin. Wash U, a favorite over Central. Um, in pretty good chance, according to the D3 Datacast computer, that Wash U is leaving that pod onto the Sweet 16, 65.6%. Pretty strong there. And then we get to I don't want to call it a pot of death, Matt, but if we talked about one that was
Mm-hmm.
maybe a little bit imbalanced in terms of how the NPI rankings compare to rankings by the D3 Datacast computer, this one's a little bit more on the heavy side, at least in terms of how the computer sees it. Of course, that has no impact on how the brackets were set, or anything like that. So, in terms of strictly seeding, I don't think that this was necessarily an unfair pod, but just the way that teams work, how they look in NPI versus maybe how the computer rankings see them. And very interesting first round matchup, as we talked about in yesterday's show, between St. John's and Chicago. Illinois Wesleyan, the host in this pod, and heavy favorites. But if we look according, across to the right there at that number in terms of who the computer likes to go on to the second weekend, Illinois Wesleyan is the favorite, but another one of those that we're seeing with a number under 50%.
Yeah, under 50%, really close to 50%, though. Sort of unfortunate that based on a relatively fair NPI seeding, they do get two pretty difficult teams in the same pod. So assuming Illinois Wesleyan could get past Bethany Lutheran, as we show like a 97% chance that they will, they can't play both of those teams. Only one team will advance. So there's only one difficult team that they have to play, but there's really no upset chance that they're going to end up getting a softer team on the next night because they get to play either St. John's or Chicago, and both of those are difficult. But yeah, the computer still sees about a 50-50 chance of getting through the first weekend for Illinois Wesleyan. That's not that bad, all things considered. You would feel like as a number 3 seed, maybe you have a little bit of an easier path, but really nothing that can be done when NPI varies that much from what maybe an efficiency would see on that kind of thing.
Then the pod host below that is La Crosse, who's a favorite to get out of that pod. And then Matt, I want to go to that that potential second weekend Friday matchup, because this is where the numbers are a little bit more interesting maybe than what we've seen in that Sweet 16 round in some of the other matchups. La Crosse, the computer does see as a favorite to win in that round, but you start looking at, even with Illinois Wesleyan maybe having lower odds, as we talked about with that number under 50%, still a 26.9 28% number there to win in the Sweet 16 round, compared to a 33.1% for UW La Crosse. So we're starting to see, the first time there's maybe a smaller margin between one of those top 8 overall seeds and another contender here, earlier in the tournament than maybe we saw in the previous two slides.
Yeah, and I think that's a portion that is maybe saying that the numbers lie to you a little bit. Whereas UW La Crosse, 33% chance to win the Sweet 16 round. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily the favorite in that, depending on the matchup. The computer would see
Right.
Illinois Wesleyan as a favorite over UW La Crosse, or even St. John's as a favorite over UW La Crosse. Am I reading that right? Yes, and Chicago would be very close to being even with them. So it's just that I think mostly what you're seeing here is that La Crosse is much more likely to get to that game than any of the other 3 individual teams are. But once that matchup is set, so like a week from now, we'll probably reset some of these odds and take another look at this. If it's La Crosse and Illinois Wesleyan that get through, I think Illinois Wesleyan is going to suddenly look like the favorite there, just because the computer sees that they're overall a stronger team. It's just that La Crosse has what the computer thinks is a little bit of an easier pod to deal with in the first weekend.
Right. The computer is a little bit less certain as to which team it's actually going to be coming out of that Illinois Wesleyan pod, right? So if you take a look at the numbers there split, below 26.9% for Illinois Wesleyan, still 19.3 for St. John's, 11.4 for Chicago. This is a little bit like that dynamic that we saw as the NJAC race was playing out down the stretch, where it was just, we knew that someone was going to be in the top 16, except there was just really no clarity as to who it was, because you had 4 pretty tightly grouped teams, and
Yeah.
everyone's odds to win it were pretty similar, right? And so that made everyone kind of 25% odds, right? So if whichever team does end up getting through to that Sweet 16, as you start adding those numbers up, you're gonna
Yeah.
very quickly surpass that 33.1% number for La Crosse. So yeah, we'll be checking on that as we're heading into the second weekend. But it looks like whoever comes out of that Illinois Wesleyan pod may very well be a favorite there to advance to the Elite Eight.
Yep.
Um, Taking a look, Platteville percent chance to win Sweet 16, 46.5%. Wash U, 33%. You're starting to see, some more numbers pop there, just because maybe the computer's a little bit more certain as to who gets through. If you're talking about winning a sectional final, Platteville, no surprises, the top ranked team in the quadrant is favored. But again, as you look at that bottom half of the bracket, part of that is just because things are a little bit more spread out, where we've talked about the uncertainty as to, we know either St. John's or Chicago is going to lose, but even if you go this far to the right, you're still you're still
Yeah.
seeing some numbers pop up for St. John's, 8.4% chance to go out of the Final Four. Chicago, 4.2%. Illinois Wesleyan, 10.4%. You start adding those up, they look pretty favorable compared to a UW La Crosse
Yeah.
at 12.6% chance to go on to the Final Four.
And there's really 2 things interacting here everywhere through these bracket odds. It's what's your team quality and what's your path, right? So once you
Right.
start converting some of these into wins, your path changes, and maybe you start looking like a favorite. We just talked about that Illinois Wesleyan pod maybe actually being the favorite over the La Crosse pod, but it just looks like everyone has a lower chance of surviving that pod. But once you do, then your odds obviously increase that much more.
All right, as we go all the way to the right, a little bit different than what we've seen out of the other 2 top seeds, Matt. The computer gives Platteville 7.1% chance to win the championship, and then Wash U about half that at 3.4, and kind of a 1% type number for St. John's and Illinois Wesleyan. Again, just it goes back to who's going to come out of that pod
Yeah.
from the opening weekend.
Yep.
Another 1% number for La Crosse. All right, let's run through the Trinity, Connecticut quadrant if you're ready, Matt. The number
Yeah.
one ranked team in the computer ratings is Trinity, Connecticut. And so no surprise to see them have the top odds all the way across, right? You see the highlighted number there all the way across the top, ending with that final 28.6% number. So very interesting, Matt. If you look at the computer's top two teams. Of course, it was 20.2% championship odds for Wesleyan, 28.6% for Trinity. So almost in those top two teams, both out of the NESCAC, if you take the combined odds for Trinity and Wesleyan, you're almost at 50%. So we're almost talking about a Trinity or Wesleyan versus the field type situation in terms of overall championship odds.
Honestly, I would take the field if you're giving me that choice. Just because it seems like
I
it's
would take the field
in
as well.
D3,
Yes,
there's just too many more. I'll take the other 62 teams just because that's a lot of teams. But yeah, that's the computer odds, and I think it is interesting that Trinity did take over the number one spot. I think we did talk about this yesterday in the efficiency ratings after their NESCAC conference tournament win. So they are the top team by the efficiency, even though they're number 4, I think, by NPI. Still on a number 1 overall line, but they do just come in with the top overall odds. Then still do see a lot of gold there. Keene State favorite over Clark in the first weekend. Then you're talking about another NESCAC team in Hamilton, favorite to advance their pod, almost 70% to beat Western New England, then still 50% to beat or to get through that game. And then the next game, the second night, against the winner of Montclair and Utica. So some, I think, looking like in this section of the bracket here, is a lot of chalk is probably going to hold, or at least the computer sees a lot of chalk holding early on here.
yeah, and talk about Trinity's odds of coming out of that opening pod. Almost 90%. You're talking about the computer sees that as better odds than a lot of teams, even highly ranked teams, have in their opening game, much less their odds for the opening weekend. Um, but other than that, Matt, you get the highlighting down there with Randolph Macon, the favorite to win like a Sweet 16 type round. With the other odds kind of split between Roanoke and Christopher Newport in terms of if you're trying to project forward who a potential opponent in that round would be. And yeah, with Trinity with that dominating number, with a 57.2% odds to go on to the Final Four, compare that down to the 2 seed in the region, a 21.8% chance for Randolph Macon.
Yeah, one point of maybe the only quote unquote upset through the first weekend that the computer is predicting here, or projecting maybe, is Roanoke. Just a little bit better than 50-50 to survive the Christopher Newport pod against their first round matchup of Pfeiffer. Christopher Newport against John Jay. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. That potential second round matchup with Roanoke and Christopher Newport looks like it could be great, and looks like it's basically a 50-50 game themselves. Although, as we did talk about earlier, this view is not necessarily taking home court advantage into account for all those games. So maybe that does flip to actual, 50-50 or just above for Christopher Newport there. So we should really think about that as well. But still not terrible odds for Randolph Macon. Still 21% to advance through the Elite Eight, 6.7% to win the whole thing. Again, that's like 3 times the average team's bracket odds. So don't count out Randolph Macon. If you counted Randolph Macon out ever, then I think you're doing it wrong. So don't count
You just
them
haven't been
out.
paying attention
Yeah,
at this point.
exactly. Even a team like Hamilton, right? I think they've been sort of quiet as really that 4th NESCAC team all season long. The computers sees them. I mean, we're talking 1% championship and 2.2% to get there, but when you're talking about a whole 64 team bracket, not terrible odds. And the way this bracket shapes up, you could get a lot of NESCAC teams in like the second weekend and very much in the mix to make the Final Four, which is not really a surprise given how good of a conference that is.
Well, the way it's paired up right now, of course, Hamilton would be on the collision course with their NESCAC rival in the Sweet 16 round, so there wouldn't be like a NESCAC versus NESCAC situation necessarily for a trip to the Final Four.
Yeah.
But Matt, as we wrap up here with our overall tournament odds, any other observations or things that are on your mind here before we, really wrap this one up and get ready to just watch how it plays out?
It's I just feel like every year I have this mindset shift. I start the year and I'm really interested in how the efficiency ratings are going as we learn a whole lot about teams, because all we knew about teams is what they're doing last year. We start to get on the court results, and then in like late January, February, I really shift into what is now like NPI zone, previously like regional ranking type zone. And so I really start to view teams for how they're ranked in NPI. And then you get the national tournament, and you see this mix of the two, right? Where we're looking at seeding and where teams are positioned. And then it's like, well, who's going to win the games? So then we mix these two, and we have this bracket odds types of things. And it's really interesting to see where those things align and where they maybe differ a little bit, and how that interacts with bracket odds. We know like a 1 versus 16 type of a game, it's going to be a mismatch, but it's really interesting more in the middle of these brackets. Even where's a 5-12 game close, or where is it not close? I think that's just really interesting to me. And then seeing those odds play out, and then how they shift once the games go on. So really interesting time of year to meld those two kind of interests of ours on the show, both efficiency and NPI. They're very different things, but they interact in the national tournament in a very interesting way.
Yeah, they sure do. And it'll be interesting to take an updated look, which we will do once we have those results and we're down to our 16 teams. We'll update this same view, and in that preview show for the Sweet 16 round, like we did coming into the first round, we'll break down all those matchups once
Yeah.
we know exactly what they are. Take an updated look at all the bracket odds to see at that point, knowing who is in the Sweet 16. Take those updated looks based on the 16 left, and run out this same kind of look from the Sweet 16 on through updated odds to win it all.
Looking forward to it, and looking forward to these games, so we can stop talking about odds and actually talk about winners and losers.
All right, let's talk about some major winners here, Matt. It's the people on our list who have offered up to support us on Patreon. Patreon.com/D3 Datacast is the platform we use, make available for people who are willing to go above and beyond and support us financially, and we are grateful for their support.
Thankful to the D3 community. Thankful for the support of these people very much. Go to D3Datacast.com. No, patreon.com/D3Datacast. If you're interested in joining them and us. I can't talk, Zach. We've been talking way too much the last 3 days. So we probably got to get out of here, but thank you so much
I
to
am
our
for sure
patrons.
sick of listening to you.
We're going to go watch these games. Enjoy your weekend. If you're traveling to see a team or you're watching them on stream, just enjoy Division III basketball. Great time of year, Zach. Enjoy talking to you. Good job, team.